Here to me. And if I think that last week I was in Freud's museum in Vienna for a meeting where I also was a speaker about the concept of the unconscious, and 1 week later in Israel, it seems that I'm going back to the roots, to the cultural roots of our discipline. So it's really, for me, a special occasion. It's the first time in Israel, so thank you very much for being here. There will be 3 papers and 3 sections this morning going on, and I hope that in the end I will be able to convey at least some basic principles of the way I practice psychoanalysis and I theorize it. Just to use a few basic words for reference, we can call it a post-Bionian model or field theory model that was developed mainly by Antonino Ferro, that I know came to Tel Aviv. Maybe some of you met him. But before Ferro, of course, there is all the work done by the Parace and Bion and Langs and other Italians and many others. Abner was saying before about how important play, so I started giving you, it has nothing to do with this, not directly with this paper, a fragment of my clinic experience. 2 days ago. There was a patient that usually spoke until the end of the session, and a few days ago she stopped 5 minutes before. It was something new. I thought a while, and I said, because with this patient there is a very playful atmosphere, can be shared. So I said, did you put yourself in a kind of standby? And she thought a while, and then she said, yes, maybe between bye-bye and stand by me. And so it was very nice because with just this play of words, something that maybe I could already know, thought of, but I didn't. Maybe I already had thought to half of it, that there was the bye-bye, but not that there was such a strong need stand by me. So you see how nice the play is a very serious thing. So let's go now to the first reading, and excuse of course my pronunciation, but you have the text. From time to time I will cut some parts of the paper, of this one and the others, because otherwise it would be too long. But in the end, the main concepts are in all of them. So then maybe in the discussion they will come out again. So there is an epigraphy at the start taken from Arthur Rimbaud, which is interesting if transposed into our own frame of problems and thinking. He says, later I explained my magical sophistries with the hallucination of words. In the end, I found that my spirit's disorder was sacred. This is a very psychoanalytic thing. From the very start with Freud, psychoanalysis started with a kind of deconstruction of the rational way of thinking. So this is what for us is sacred. The commonest experience of depersonalization occurs when a physical trauma changes our habitual sense of psychosomatic coherence, and we painfully realize that we are living in a place that is no longer familiar, and where we have no command on the language. It is of little consequence whether or not there is a wound that can be objectively measured, because the event is not limited by the body, but instantly cracks the integrity of the self and calls all the available psychic defenses into action. So let's start with another clinical fragment. This is a very peculiar of this way of conceiving psychoanalysis. Really, we are always aimed at arriving to the clinic. We love the clinic. We love to try to find new, precise tools to do our job better. So theory is important, can also be very sophisticated, and also quite abstract in some moments, but always the end is to get to the clinic. So this is a dream. I was in the car with someone on the passenger's side. Out of the sky, enormous car tires were raining down on us, maybe from trucks or buses. I was upset and scared that any moment I'd be hit, but it didn't happen the way I was afraid it would. Instead, I was fascinated by the scene and started filming it with my phone. Then we were hit from the other side by endless dead or injured birds falling onto the roof of the car and making a red carpet of blood all around. At that point, I woke up. There is nothing in the imagery of the nightmare that directly recalls the trauma of which it is the consequence. Yet, the case alters if we think of dreaming as a metaphor of the emotional experience. And I'd add of the current emotional experience. Let's start to emphasize this. For Winnicott, well, this is a nice lapsus. I was saying for Bion, but of course, this is my most Bionian, Winnicottian. No, I was asked by, this is published in the Revue Française de Psychanalyse. And for Bion, the goal of psychoanalysis is to focus on the current, deep, unconscious emotional experience. This is, and he says nothing else counts. He says this very directly in his tankish, so to say, military mode. He says something, if you think that psychoanalysis is something else, you don't understand the spirit of psychoanalysis. So, this is very impressive because I think of Bion as the champion of a kind of principle of systematic doubt. And then he comes out in some places with this very direct, assertive tone. But this is not that he renounced the systematic doubts, I think. It is more that he wants to be very rigorous. Anyway, so the emotional current experience. So how do we listen to this dream? Ada's dream is trying to represent, I'd say, in a poetic manner, the distress which was afflicting her at that time, concerning her fear that she had lost her hearing after a serious ear infection. This is the real trauma, the concrete trauma. Suddenly, and we see how the dream is trying to give a meaning to this. No? As we can anticipate, as our way of conceiving theorizing the dream today and the dreaming activity is very similar to what Freud writes in Beyond the Pleasure Principle, when he says that the dreaming is the activity aimed at transforming a fright, Shrek, into anxiety, angst, which is quite impressive. Suddenly, Ada could no longer hear her own voice, and the voices of others sounded distant and metallic. Her body and the world abruptly ceased to be hospitable. The work undertaken by dreaming in order to transform such devastating emotions has failed. This is why she has the nightmare, or we might say has failed only partially, not at all. And yet, in part, the dream succeeds, in fact, in mastering Ada's turmoil and gives her these images. In the days that followed, Ada came back repeatedly with this thought, to try and grasp its secret, to nourish herself with it, to find a possible meaning for it. As she had been at the moment of having the dream, she was fascinated by the weirdness of the situation, which points ambiguously in various directions. The scene troubles and intrigues her as it did in the dream. It reassures her and almost makes her smile at the idea that she could recapture it with her phone's video camera. She thinks it means all is not lost, that perhaps it is simply a matter of regaining, a little at a time, her mind's capacity to reflect and finding some distance from what has happened to her. In the dream, Ada's act of filming this scene highlights how important it can be that we remain able to construct a continuous film of meaning which defends us against possible traumas. The psychic scheme produced by the dream is the mask of self-deceit in the etymological sense of the Latin fingere, which means to shape, to think, which allows one to become a person. Indeed, in Latin, persona, as you know, means mask. We could call this capacity the mind's poetic function. By this, I mean, by the way, I don't know if it is written later in the paper, but the metaphor of the poetry of the mind is Freud's. As you see, I love Freud and always go back to him, even if I try to go on. It is this metaphor, he uses this metaphor in the book on aphasia. Is that pronounced well? Okay, aphasia, okay. So, by this I mean that we can see dreaming whether at night or when awake, according to Bill's concept of waking dream thought, as an unconscious and conscious psychological work of digesting proto-emotions and proto-sensation, the so-called beta elements. The adjective poetic indicates that this is not a question of merely logical or abstract necessity, but also a physical and emotional necessity. Giving meaning to experience in such a way that what we live may be felt as true and real is a matter for the emotions. And I say not only for the intellectual understanding, even if, of course, we have self-reflectiveness, and even if we concentrate on our emotional experience, we are always subject, so we somehow we are never really, it would be impossible, distanced from, so to say, our own also conceptual architecture, so to say. Hence, I adopt the metaphor of poetry and of art in general, because when it moves us, when it is not interrupted, and as it would be by a nightmare, it satisfies us on both the affective and intellectual plane, and helps us to rediscover a harmony between body and mind, to give body back to the mind, or vice versa. You see now in the background Winnicott's concept of immuling the psyche in the body, and to reinstate the psyche in the body. The ability to dream, which we all have to a greater or lesser degree, makes us all poets. This ability to compose the poetry of the real, which Bionian calls maternal reverie and Winnicott primary maternal preoccupation, helps psychological birth, and once introjected gives a savor to our whole existence. It sets up the psychosomatic collusion on which we base the naturalness of our bodily experiences, the alliance which suffers or is broken when we are prey to experiences of depersonalization or derealization, which are simply two sides of the same coin. In fact, the unconscious, repressed or not repressed, cannot be thought about if not in relation to the other. It is always rooted in the symbolic. The subject is constitutionally trans-individual or intersubjective, we might say, but sometimes the problem with this term is that it is confused with interpersonal, which is, in my opinion, a different thing. For Bion, the mind can only exist in a group. For Winnicott, there is no such thing as, as a baby. For Laplanche, the unconscious is formed by the translation of the enigmatic sexual messages sent by the mother to her baby. In other words, no subject can exist except on the understanding that it is part of a field of relationships. The ego is not master in its own house. Its dwelling place is sociality. For the same reason, we can say that the unconscious is also not master, so to say, in its own house. The decentering of the ego is a recentering on the other and on the relationship with it. I'll skip this. Let's go to the next paragraph. This is why, when the body or the world become alien, the crisis of meaning never actually refers to the subject as being isolated, but to the subject in its fantasized relationship with the other, the group. Thus, the natural propensity to transference which Freud attributes to dream can be found again in Ada's impulse to tell her trauma and its connected dream, not only to me, but repeatedly to herself and potentially to everyone. In this way, she tries to repair the alliance with the other out of which she was born as a subject and which now feels ruined. As Ogden, as usual, splendidly suggests, the model for all treatment lies in this search. Depending on the gravity of their suffering, patients ask us only to help them to dream the dream that they have never succeeded in dreaming. This is the case for mostly psychotic patients, or to resume the dreaming of their interrupted dreams, meaning people that were able to dream, that is to digest their emotional experience or giving a personal meaning to experience, and that at a certain point were not able to, for a while, because maybe overwhelmed by a flux of, so to say, beta elements, they stopped being capable of dreaming their experience. After all, this is a matter of regaining contact with the primary object. If it is true that, as Pontelis maintains, the dream means to be reunited with the mother in a space before time. Now let's go back again to the dream. The blood that covers all the surrounding land in Ada's dream is a terrifying image. Rationally, being awake, we could say it is certainly out of proportion to the event, but the dream amplifies the smallest emotional signal thanks to its characteristic hypochondria. This is Freud's notion. Freud says that sometimes in the dream you can find the tiniest signals of a bodily disease that you cannot see in wakeful state, but we can apply the same thing, of course, to the psychological suffering. This is a very, very interesting notion, the hypochondria of the dream. In reality, that which seems an amplification to our conscious thought is the exact representation, even if only for the fraction, for split seconds, of how the event felt in the inner world with its real emotional impact. This is why when we listen to patients, if we want to shed light on psychic reality, as after all Freud said he did, we must listen to the derivatives of our unconscious thoughts and put material reality between parentheses. The analyst must enter into a state, so to say, of hallucinosis. That's why the epigraphy by Arthur Rimbaud, which is the inverse of and symmetrical to that of the patient. Only in this way can he see what the patient sees, including his hallucinations. We will come back to more precisely on this notion. Naturally, we could put a lot of effort into decoding the dream in order to give it a symbolic reading, in the more traditional classical way. The blood, the birds, the wounded narcissism, the presence of the mysterious driver, the phone as a technological prosthesis in the service of a fantasy of immortality. But in reality, this work of deciphering, which would have meaning if undertaken from the point of view of a study of the other, as a subject in isolation, would not help him, or not so much, in his effort to give a poetic, integrative, emotional meaning to the trauma he has experienced. It is true that Freud links the recovery of the repressed to its reconnection with the corresponding affect, but he nevertheless neglects the role of the object. As he himself explains, he constructs a model based on a fiction of the object in isolation. It clearly writes this, it's in the paper on two principles of mental functioning in a footnote. He says, well, the representation I give of the newborn, as it were, in a kind of egg, it's a fiction. I think that he uses this word, but it is as if he said, but for my purpose I need to stick to this fiction. In terms of intersubjectivity, what should be done is not understanding the dream, so as to let it try and be dreamt again. In reality, this is obviously a question of making oneself open to a different kind of understanding, not so much abstract or intellectual, but conscious. And this is so precisely because the poetry of the dream dreamt by the unconscious reintegrates psyche and soma. As Ogden writes, the unconscious speaks with an accent of truth that our conscious experience lacks. So this is really one of the principles that I consider really important to me. No? We should try to theorize why Ogden can say something like this, why he says that the conscious thinking is useful for our daily tasks, but in order to give full meaning to experience, we need the unconscious thinking, and that the unconscious thinking is the most profound kind of psychological work we can do. So this is incredibly interesting, but we should try to explain why. Why the unconscious thinking? Okay, it is true, it gives us so many different perspectives on reality. So when we have many different perspectives on reality, which are not arbitrary but can be shared by other people, this I'd say could be a nice definition of health. When we are able to see all the contradictions of life, the dialectic of life, the paradox, our souls expands when we are able to do this, and the unconscious thinking makes us in the condition to do this. But why? So that's why I try to use the metaphor of poetry, because usually this is also something that we ask art for us to help us, art and poetry, because the poetry, the specific language of poetry, is intellectual, semantic, but also semiotic. It's much more open. In poetry, we value the ambiguity. Ambiguity is a positive quality of poetry, and that's why maybe the peculiar language of poetry and of the unconscious is able to generate for us all these nice and productive perspectives. So this is really a very, very important point, in my opinion, because it explains to us, it gives us a direction. Why should we go after this unconscious thinking? Why should we put ourselves in the best mental state of trying to dream our experience with the patient? We don't have to think that this is given. We should try to explain and theorize why it is so, and ask ourselves, it is really so. So, from the analytic point of view, it matters more to focus not on the nexus between the trauma and the dream, in my opinion, but on the telling of the dream as a derivative of the here and now of the dream thought. And we will then be able to think of it, for example, as marking a feeling of fragility in the analysis and at the start in the present moment, and with ambivalence aspect of an intense persecutory distress. What am I saying here? This is already an example of what maybe Nino Ferro told you about transformation in dreaming, meaning that the telling of the night dream of the patient becomes the dream of the couple somehow dreamt in the here and now, because there is always, inevitably, there is always this unconscious communication going on. So it is true that Hada had this dream, it is true that she had the trauma and then the dream during the night. But in the moment she tells the dream in the session, this becomes the shared dream of the couple, and we should ask ourselves what is going on. What is the problem in hearing? How all the elements of the dream could be a kind of narrative that helps us to intuit what is, and we go back to Bionian, what is the current deep emotional experience. And even this then we have to explain, and I think that we will do this in the moment. Why it is so important to understand the emotional current experience. This is not the last episode of the, so to say, theoretical narrative. I can anticipate what I answer myself, that if you understand the emotional, the deep emotional experience in the here and now, sometimes it's manifest, sometimes it's clear, but most of the times it's not. Then you understand what the patient is feeling, what are his or her needs, like a baby. If the baby is crying, why is he crying? Is he hungry? Is he cold? He has pain. Something is aching somewhere, he has pain, so you have to give the right answer. So, if we understand what is going on in the here and now, as emotional experience, we draw a kind of map of the field of what is going on, and it is more likely that we can meet the patient then. And when we meet the patient, then we have the possibility to be at unison or in attunement, or what the people from Boston, Stern and the other call moments of meeting, a dyadic expansion of consciousness. We have many different ways of saying it. And this is still not the last episode, because we, on a theoretical plane, should also say, but why? Why this unison should be so important? Why this attunement should be so important? But we leave this question for later, so... Okay, let's go on. So, the voices of the world. Now I want to show how trying to work with this patient around this dream, a kind of memory, reverie that came to me about something I had read before, proved itself somehow useful. Dream thought, which in everyday life allows us to digest emotions, can also be used as a technical resource in analysis. I shall give an example. Thinking about Ada's dream, which strikes me forcibly as I hear it, and connecting it to her distress and her feeling of bodily change, which, I repeat, goes well beyond its concrete and objectively appreciable character. And clearly I am concerned here with the real distress of depersonalization unleashed by the trauma. At a certain point in the session, there comes into my mind a book by Robert Schneider called Brother of Sleep, that I had read some years before. The protagonist of the novel, Elias, suffers not from hearing loss, but from an equally painful over-acuteness of hearing, just like Ada, but in the opposite way, precisely because it is not the nature of the wound in itself that matters, but what it means practically in terms of identity, is not screened off from the voices and noises of the world which penetrate him, leaving him defenseless against them. Ada's dream and Schneider's novel show that psychic equilibrium is founded on a harmonious dialectic between identity and difference, between being open and closed to the stimuli of internal and external reality. In Bion's jargon, between alpha and beta. Any excessive closure implies an automatically heightened opening, and vice versa. It is an alternating game which can only oscillate within parameters limited by transformation in hallucinosis and transformation in dream. Elias suffers an experience of depersonalization during which he develops a truly extraordinary power of hearing, and meanwhile his body is transformed into that of a monster, before returning to what it was before, apart from the color of his eyes. You can read this part, which is beautifully impressive by your own, and I skipped this part to gain some time. The book is really impressive. There are very striking descriptions of how the heightened faculty of perception extends step by step into a hypochondriac hearing of the body, the perception of a situation of disharmony with the object, and lastly, the evocation of a primordial world which we can imagine as the chaos of signs by which the baby is bombarded from birth. There is again another long quote from the book, but again, it's better if we go on at the end of it, so you have the possibility to read it because you have the text. So, from this extraordinary passage, we can clearly see how necessary it is to have a filtering, modulating function for the sensory stimuli and raw emotions which assail us. For Bion, the alpha function transforms beta elements into alpha elements, images mainly, representations, stripping them of their excessive emotional charge. In a hypochondriac explosion, Elias suffers a tearing open of the film of meaning which protects us from the sleep of waking, from the naive realism with which we look at the things of the world. The wound feeds, in his case, an artistic vocation. He becomes a prodigious musician, but remains alone, never finds love, and ends his life tragically. We can ask ourselves, from the technical point of view, what does this reverie of mine, we can consider it a reverie. Sometimes it's difficult to say if it's more an association or a reverie and so on, but let's consider it a kind of reverie. It depends also from the particular quality of the experience you feel when some images comes through your mind. What does this reverie of mine possibly add to Ada's dream and to our understanding of this dream? I think that above all, it adds the colors of the troubling emotions I had felt when reading the novel, which really impressed me. So you see, it's a bit like the play of words I told you at the start. No? I already knew that the end of the session was arriving, that maybe my patient was silent because she was a bit anxious, or maybe because she was a bit protesting, and but it was only when we had this emotionally charged exchange of words, not with the stand by me and bye bye, that something that we already knew intellectually became more alive, more true. So this is the idea. So it adds the traces of an understanding that is not merely intellectual, but also physical, bodily, non-verbal. Above all, then, but on a different, more informative level, it is clear to me that this is not so much about the fear of losing a physical capacity, but a terror of being abandoned by everyone, even by me, of going mad, of becoming a pariah, as happens to Elias. So my reference to Elias, to the book, helps me to understand in a more emotional way, in a more convincing way, that what was really at stake was not so much the damage, the possibility of the hearing loss, now seen in its concrete meaning, but the fact that as Elias in the book, she would feel rejected by everybody, and even by me, she would feel isolated. So you see, a much deeper dynamic. It is that the voice and body which feel changed are not only her voice and body, but the maternal tongue and body. This intuition allows me to make her observe her emotional problem against the backgrowth of Elias, about which I have no need to tell her anything, even if I could have. This depends from the context. And thereby see the anguish expressed in the dream from a perspective which greatly enhances its meaning. From this memory or reverie, I feel I have succeeded in speaking to Ada with an accent of truth, which perhaps I would not have been able to if I had limited myself to understanding the dream, and not given myself the possibility and the time to, so to say, re-dream it, or to assimilate it, not only rationally, but also emotionally. The other thing that I find extraordinary in Schneider's novel is the turning of a disability into a superpower. You know very well that this is the story of all the superheroes in the comics and films. These two, for example, come si chiama l'uomo ragno? The Spider-Man, yes. The Spider-Man lost his parents. Another one, there was a scientist in a laboratory and there was a big explosion. So in a metaphorical way, the history of all these superheroes have some big trauma at the start. This is the reason why somehow we like it, we love it. I can confess that lately I also started to watch with great astonishment of my kids the Lego Batman movie, which is wonderful, by the way. Anyway, this too puts us in contact not only with Ada's hearing loss and her narcissistic wound, but also with the hyperesthesia that is typical of the paranoia, which derives from it and is at the core of depression. The Freudian shadow of the object stretches over the ego like that of Murnau's Nosferatu over the defenseless victim, and of depersonalization. Lastly, the vignette is also an example of how we can be cast as characters in the analytic dialogue in order to develop the narratives in the field and to broaden the range of meaning. Personalization. The infant's mind develops through being reflected in the mother's face, a face that in reality is more an indistinct field of experience in which little by little primitive and still crude sensory rhythms are set up. So it's more the concept by Kristeva of chora semiotic. At the start of life, the initial nucleus of identity is produced and thereafter continues to be produced by sensory, bodily, tactile, musical means, in a word, pre-representative or semiotic. Following Ogden, we could say, from a zone of sensation with a calming quality in a state that does not differentiate between subject and object, or following Merleau-Ponty from a state of intercorporeality. This point by Ogden, I find it really striking, wonderful. He says that the first subjectivity we can think of, so the start of a subject, is this area of two skin surfaces getting in touch and producing a soothing and having a soothing quality, and producing a feeling of calm, security and safeness. But it's just two skin that are touching each other. From the mother, the infant internalizes the capacity to form visual images out of proto-sensations and proto-emotions, and thus succeeds in personalizing reality, making it subjective, personal, and assigning it a personal meaning. Like the cells of the body, those of the psyche also need to be constantly regenerated. The function which presides over this activity is the alpha function, the ability to transform sensations in order to create emotional significant images, not pure perceptions. Bion repeatedly uses the verb assimilate to differentiate having a consciousness from becoming a consciousness. That is, the innate capacity to perceive stimuli and an understanding based on culture. The self is not achieved once and for all. Dreaming repairs, constructs the psychic scheme, the film of meaning which protects us from the impacts of reality, the concept outlined by Freud and later endorsed by other writers. But why dreaming and not logic? So, you see, we go always back to the same main points because they are very, very important, and we try to see them from different perspectives, trying to catch their truth. Again, so, why dreaming and not logical or rational thought? And I could also add that in my opinion, it's not only my opinion, for example, the Botteglia said the same, psychoanalysis during decades became too rational, too made of explanations, on the contrary, we should rediscover the centrality of dream in the paradigm of psychoanalysis, starting from Freud. But even because this is our experience, we experience every day that if we give a logical explanation to the patient based on our theoretical understanding, it doesn't change anything. Yes, it's always useful, but it's superficial. Something changes sometimes if those explanations are the vehicle to are the medium to arrive to an emotional unison, which is different. Because in my opinion, every dream, as poetry of the mind, gives the body back to the mind, or rather vice versa, reinstates the psyche in the body, constantly seeking to rediscover harmony between body and mind. I picture every successful dream and what is dreamlike in the session, meaning reverie, exactly as a poem, as something that extends our knowledge of reality, helps us to make it more ambiguous, richer, and speaks both to the body through the play of the body of the word, the signifier, and to the mind. The mind, thought, is not born just from the absence of the object, as Bionian says, but I'm sure that he implies something else that I like usually to make very clear. But from the bearable absence of the object, of course. From the happy rhythm of absence, presence, on, off, forth, down. Presence, which is also a matter of quality, is experienced every time we are able to log into the Wi-Fi area of unconscious interpersonal, or better intersubjective communication, and to live in an experience of emotional unison, the experience which Ada, Elias feel is painful missing. Here there are other names, because in the original paper, which is much longer, I give other examples taken from literature. Especially one is beautiful because it's from a short story by Ingeborg Bachmann, which is a wonderful writer. If once again we want to use Bion's terminology, to be in unison could mean to effect a transformation of emotional experience for, with the patient, painting it in the colors of reverie, as a painter would color a landscape, that is, in a way that is recognizable and can be shared. It might be that these colors are what Bion calls the invariants, the quid that is difficult to define, but which allows us to ascribe a subject to the picture and vice versa. The same face can be described in words, or painted, or animated as a cartoon, etc., but should always be recognizable, and if possible always hold our attention and move us. These would be transformations in different media, but they all obey the same psychological logic. What matters is to pass on a technique for making this transformation more than their content. So this is another basic principle. This new paradigm, the Bionian paradigm of psychoanalysis, post-Bionian, is much more concerned in developing function than in retrieving repressed contents. So it's a different orientation. Using if we want to say it in using Winnicott's ideas, we might say, and I find this a wonderful concept. And there is a nice paper in the International Journal by a French author, the name is Girard, I think, about this this differentiation Winnicott does between ego needs and id needs, which I find extremely useful. So, using Winnicott's ideas, we might say the same thing in these terms: to satisfy the needs of the ego and not only those of the id. Depersonalization. As we know, I'll take another because we started depersonalization. As we know, the ego is based on the bodily ego. Thought, as we have said, emerges from the body as poetry does from the mind. Depersonalization, in the title of this paper and the heading of this paragraph, I have written the word with a hyphen to emphasize that it is the opposite of what Winnicott calls, at least in my use of it, in my interpretation, personalization. It's the symptom of a dissociation between mind and body. It is a break in the psychosomatic cohesion that is the basis for a healthy self, which is not the ego, is the person who is me, writes Winnicott. A loss of psychosomatic unity in experience. The disturbance takes hold when the subject is bombarded by dissociated messages from the object or the world as object, which it is unable to decipher. By the way, this is also our common experience. No? How many times we have patients who we see have used very rational defenses and are completely unable to really get in touch with their emotions. So this is, we could also have maybe less frequently the other kind of patient, a patient that is completely overwhelmed by uncontainable emotions and that is, how shall I say, and that has behaviors absolutely not coordinated and so on. Then the emotions are evacuated straight away before having been transformed into representation, or in more favorable cases, they dry up into the sophisticated defenses of intellectualization. In both situations, a psychic hemorrhage occurs. In the language of Bionian, he writes, cogitation, evacuation of emotion, based on non-transformed emotion, evidenced by the absence of all connections that are emotions, leads to disintegration of the patient, because that which holds the objects together is no longer available. This differs from splitting in that it is a passive falling apart of the objects. Think of the Hulk, to go back to Hollywood. When he gets angry, he swells up and tears his clothes to shreds. This makes extraordinarily visible what happens in reality in the head of the psychic skin. There is a reduction in the capacity to contain and transform emotions in such a way as to sustain oneself by the motivating pressure of their cognitive content. This ability to transform emotions is not inborn, but is acquired. No? If another mind or mind are available. This is another strong basic principle. From this point of view, to make a mind, another mind is needed. Of course, again, we might say everybody knew this, everybody told this, yes, but not in this way. Now we say it in a different way, meaning in a much more, in my opinion, complete and convincing frame of theoretical references. It's not just that the object has to be there to give food and to provide, but with Bionian we have the emphasis on the particular quality that the mind of the other has to have, and also we have many very nice theoretical tools to understand the capacity for reverie and the powerful model of the container, and so on, to understand how this process goes on. So we might say, okay, Freud or somebody else already said this, it was implicit, yes, but again, it's not enough. When something has gone wrong, the disharmony in relationships reflected in the internalization of an impaired alpha function can become a body dysmorphic disorder, hypochondriac anxiety, the feeling of not living an authentic life, every kind of symptom from mild to serious, and even the sense of not being at ease in one's own skin. From a certain point of view, there is not one symptom that cannot be seen from the perspective of depersonalization and of exile from the land mother, from the social matrix of subjectivity, even if it is yet to be understood why some people develop one symptom and others a different one. Hypotheses about fragilities, whether constitutional or generated by emotional or physical traumas, particular sequences of alpha elements, or the variable distance to which it is necessary to draw beta elements, this is the hypothesis I prefer, are perhaps risky but not wrong-headed. The fact is, we do not know. But if we view psychoanalysis as a domain of transformation, then inquiring into the psychopathological distinctiveness of a certain clinical scenario is a matter of only moderate importance, and one which fundamentally contradicts the requirement that we renounce the objectification of the other. I mean that every time we go back to our nice psychopathological, our psychiatric semiotic and so on, this can be very useful from the psychiatric point of view, and I'm very happy to be also a psychiatrist, and I love but from the point of view of psychoanalysis, very often the risk is that you objectify the patient. You are not anymore there somehow really to meet him, but you defend yourself against a real encounter. Things can go wrong for various, even opposite reasons, as Bion writes in a passage from Transformations. I will skip this, but mainly is about two different attitudes of the object, of the mother. A mother that is not coherent, produces a certain kind of symptoms, and a mother that is too worried about being a perfect mother, so too narcissistic, absorbed in herself, also can cause problems. And of course, this applies as a model also to the analyst with his patient. No? If Bion underlines the mother in this passage, the mother's inadequacy, Winnicott makes us see things from the opposite direction. Because, and that's why we thank so much Winnicott, because the problems can also come from the child. Yes, otherwise it's too persecutory for us. No? Even if we know that we have to renounce the idea of being perfect, and I think that one of the most beautiful and useful tools we got from Winnicott is the idea of the good enough. The good enough is great. We breathe when we go back to this. Otherwise it would be too persecutory, not too overwhelming. All the responsibility we have. Now we have to... So, this is Winnicott. The mother is continually introducing and reintroducing the baby's body and psyche to each other, and it can readily be seen that this easy but important task becomes difficult if the baby has an abnormality that makes the mother feel ashamed, guilty, frightened, excited, hopeless. Under such circumstances, she can do her best, and not more. I myself have given a lot of attention to these topics. Myself, I mean it, end of quotes. Through, for example, the concept of aesthetic conflict, or writing about hypochondria as the exile of the subject in the body world, about how the depictions of the pictorial arts may be an allegory of how one loses one's head in affective relationships, or of the kinds of internet dependency which we observe nowadays, in the forefront of which is the search for this is the part that I cut in the paper. So I have a last paragraph, 2 pages and a half. I think that we can go through the next 5 minutes. Language of effectuality, or maybe, I don't know if this is the right translation, effectivity, maybe, I don't know. It's beyond concepts. If depersonalization opens a breach in being, if alpha function is impaired either because it has encountered a traumatic reality or because it is defective from birth. The problem is how to reform this unity, how to tie affect and representation again, emotion and thought together, how to heal the wound. Various answers can be given, not least because we would need to speak of therapeutic actions in the plural. Nevertheless, I'd like to privilege here the Bionian language of effectuality. With this formula, Bion shows how the analyst should speak to the patient and communicate aesthetically. Aesthetically, I start to say, it's not to mean here something that is ornamental, to speak in an elegant way, absolutely not. The meaning of this word is really linked here to the etymology, aesthesis, Greek, which is sensation. It means to be attentive to the non-verbal dialogue, to emotions, to the different ways in which we communicate and generate an important aspect, maybe the most important for our purposes, aspect of meaning. So when we say aesthetic, what we have in mind is that the subject is born in an aesthetic intersubjective space. So this is the idea, because the newborn doesn't have a language, so how can he become a subject? Aesthetically. So, with this formula, Bion shows how the analyst should speak to the patient and communicate aesthetically, putting himself on the same wavelength so as to transmit to him the recomposition of the psychosomatic unity of experience, which he has in the meantime succeeded temporarily, at least, in achieving. In a paper devoted to this subject, Bonaminio, that many of you surely know, and that told me that he had been here before, uses a pregnant image when he describes the game with the watch that the father of a little patient plays as a way of trying to help his son rediscover a feeling of security, of reinstating the temporality, which is our only means of forming a mind. It is a beautiful metaphor to express what, in my opinion, is the main therapeutic factor in analysis, and child analysts know this better than anyone. Working in step, dancing, in fact, being in unison, or at one, to be at one. When we are not in step, the patient's depersonalization is reflected in the depersonalization of the analytic field. A depersonalized field would function too concretely or too intellectually. But how do we treat a depersonalized field? What can we learn from Ada Stream, from the books by Schneider and the others that I quoted in the original paper? I'd say that the poetry of dreaming, whether nocturnal or waking, allows us to rediscover the psychosomatic unity of experience inside ourselves and between us and the other. Again, it is exactly what the reason why we always try to go to arts, to feel emotions, because when, for example, we see a beautiful piece at the theater and we love it, even if it's Sophocles, even if or Shakespeare, and then we come out of the theater and we feel that we are more human. And this is at the same time intellectual feeling and also very deeply felt, emotional. No? So this is the kind of unity we have to to try to find. And what is our main tool to try to rediscover this meaning, if not trying to become receptive to the dream of the session? When we are able to dream the session, meaning to give meaning to the session in both ways, intellectually and with our body, emotionally, in ourselves we reconnect the one with the other, thanks to, as we said before, to the particular language and the particular characteristic of the language of the unconscious, no? And the language of dreaming, that is, it's an emanation of it. This transformation is the premise for gaining access to the language of effectuality. We have seen the importance of the analyst's personality, his style. This is another important concept. Style, writes Victor Hugo, is the depths of the subject incessantly called to the surface. For the analyst, as for the artist, style is no mere external adornment, but a way of thinking and knowing and of expressing himself. Interpretation should be immediate, simple, communicative, alive, free of jargon, not so much interpret but conversate with the patient. It should go right to the heart of the matter. Style, that is the persona, the signature, the subjectivity of the author, is the indicator of the analyst's profound engagement and at the same time of his ability to feel and observe, even while maintaining a certain distance. It is also true that interpretation is often silent and nevertheless transforms the analytic field. Winnicott says that when the analyst understands, he is silent. It's a paradox, but no. There is some truth. And he also says that, and this also I found very, very useful, that if the patient talks for all the hour and the analyst is not given the possibility to say anything, it doesn't matter, because the patient is expressing a profound need to be known. And this is why it does. The last half page, and then it's the end of this first section. The patient must be able to have an emotional experience. He must see and recognize himself reflected in the text of the interpretation, and if possible, feel the same happiness in it, the same sense of well-being or feeling or fullness of life that we feel when we have an aesthetic experience, an event in which we make contact with something that we have inside us, without knowing it or without knowing it enough. Thanks to the mind and the artist's creative capacity for reverie. Hearing an interpretation means letting oneself be heard by its text, letting this illuminate one's experience and understanding of things. In his Paris seminar with Resnick, who unfortunately left us, as you know, a little time ago. He was a good friend of Sarama. Bionian invites analysts to make themselves artists in speaking to their patients, to use the colors they have and that they often do not know they have. This is why I use the lines from Rimbaud as an epigraph, to underline the importance of trusting the unconscious work of the mind and to use, albeit in a disciplined manner, the intuitions given us by dreams.
Thank you, Giuseppe. I can't thank you enough for saying all these things so clearly. I will not discuss Giuseppe's paper, but I would just like to raise some points so as to begin the discussion. For me, it is very important that Giuseppe shows us again for concepts in field theory, that often the patient internalizes not this or that interpretation, but the function and process of seeking and searching for meaning. In fact, it is related to the fact that the word Deutung, I'm not sure I write it correctly, which Freud uses and which has been translated by Strachey as interpretation, actually means giving or making meaning. And I think Giuseppe shows us how meaning is made or given. I think Giuseppe illustrates how patients bring their dreams to analysts, not only to have their dreams interpreted, but to continue dreaming with the analyst aspects of the dreams that they have not been able to fully dream on their own. From this perspective, it is the unsuccessful dream, the unthought, undreamt dream thought, that is evacuated into dream imagery and then brought to the analyst for help in thinking what has been, to that point, a non-existent or perhaps barely begun thinking process. I'd like to open the discussion with the audience, and in the spirit of what we've heard and will continue to hear, to invite all of you to feel free to free associate and to play with the material Giuseppe has brought us. There's no need to formulate a structured comment or question. Just feel free to say whatever comes to your mind. In Hebrew also, if you feel more comfortable. We only have a few minutes for just a few comments, but we will continue throughout the day to talk about all the papers.
In Italian we say that somebody has to break the ice. I imagine that you have an expression like this. Just a quick, very quick remark. It is implicit, and I'm sure that you all already know, that when we say dream in the session and so, we use the dream in so different ways, and also we work with it in a different ways. Of course, before all of this, there is a big change in the way we conceptualize the unconscious. This is very important, because otherwise everything becomes incredibly difficult. So the unconscious is not anymore Freud's unconscious, the repressed unconscious, but it is thought of, as Bion says, as a psychoanalytic function of the personality, as an apparatus to symbolize. So this is very different. That's why, in the end, the dreaming becomes more or less equivalent to thinking. Because if we have in mind the other scheme of the unconscious as a kind of jail where the repressed bad thoughts are captive, then of course it becomes very difficult to understand Bion. But as you know, Bion starts from this important postulate. He reconceptualized entirely the concept of unconscious. If we want to emphasize the continuity, we might say that if we look at the Traumarbeit, there is in it a part aimed at destroying or hiding the meaning, but at the same time Freud developed the concept of displacement and condensation, so gave us also the concept to understand how the Traumarbeit constructs meaning. So, for example, Pontalis, and I do agree, said, and also the Botteglia, that now this kind of psychoanalysis, we are giving much more importance to the expressive side of the Traumarbeit. So this is a way. And of course, in order to understand, and then I really stop, but it's important, because otherwise everything can become confused. If the other important idea that we have to keep in mind in order to understand how Bion changes completely the idea we have of the unconscious is the reference to Melanie Klein. when in child psychoanalysis, the work becomes all focused in the unconscious fantasies in the here and now, and the work is all about developing the capacity of the child to symbolize. And the tool is play, and the play is completely fictional, all of it. Everything is fictional within the play, and you can see then that Bion didn't do anything different than just developing this idea. So something that can also seem quite strange, weird. How this Bion at certain point, right to say that we dream also during the day and a different understanding of unconscious is perfectly understandable if we look at this kind of development, that continuity that goes through all our main authors.
So you not only broke the ice, but you also rescued us from silence.
But now I really stop.
And now we'll have to go for a break. We have about
we have 5 minutes.
Yeah, we have a few minutes. If somebody wants to make a comment, this is the time.
Nino Ferro would say, first speak and then think. Which also is a way to put your unconscious at work. So don't be shy.
Okay, I'll take your recommendation and speak, and then I think. I wanted to ask, what do you think about the act of interpretation in the analytic situation versus a change of the being of the therapist, the way of being? Because what you call reverie, I thought maybe it changes the therapist. And what changes is not understanding of the patient, but it's in a deep empathic layers that changes the analyst attitude to the patients. So
the reverie, you mean?
yeah,
Yeah. Yes.
It's a transform.
Yeah.
In your way, in your language, maybe we can call it transformation in being.
Yeah. But the overall idea is that the couple somehow is seen as a group, or as somehow a collective mind, we might say, that is trying together through this unconscious communication that of course we cannot control, and so it is there. And to try to understand what is happening, to give a meaning to what is happening. So this means that when this attribution of meaning becomes possible, even both the patient and the analyst change, and their mind grow. And then maybe later we could be more precise on this. What do we imply when we say that the mind develops and grow? And so, for example, reverie, which is those images that come to our minds, and what is their quality? Is that like a dream, sometimes, most of the times, they have no connection with the analytic dialogue. That's why we call them a dream and not just an association. But giving attention to these formations, and if we think that somehow they are the product of this unconscious process of digestion that is going on all the time, even if it came to the mind of the analyst, doesn't matter. It belongs to the couple somehow. It is related to their experience, to their intersubjective experience, because the interiority, we might say, the interiority of the analyst becomes a place in the shared field, in the shared analytic field. So sometimes it is the patient or it is the analyst that give voice to something that is an emanation somehow of their, of the group at work. This is the basic idea.